Chapter 1. The Announcement. The first rays of morning light fell upon the cobblestone square of Elmridge-on-Glen, a village so unchanging that its clock tower had not missed a chime in a century. But on this particular Wednesday, an unexpected notice in the Elmridge Echo shattered the steady rhythm of village life. Every doorstep bore a paper, each front page emblazoned with a single, astonishing statement. A murder will take place this Sunday, July 14th at 7 p.m. in the Conservatory of White Willows Manor. Attendance expected. The words spread with the speed of whispered confessions. A postman left his rounds half-finished. A milkman, startled, abandoned his cart at the crossroads. In kitchens and sitting rooms, villagers read and reread the line until the letters seemed to dance before their eyes. Their first instinct was disbelief, but disbelief quickly shifted into something stranger, a collective thrill, the sort found only in the pages of a detective novel. Within hours, the announcement had leapt from doorstep to village green. The Conservatory of White Willows Manor, a glass-domed room with creeping vines and flickering lanterns, became the center of hushed speculation. Eyes darted toward the manor's tall iron gates, which loomed over the western edge of the village like a watchful sentinel. Mrs. Prudence Whitlock, a retired schoolmistress known to memorize every letter of the Echo, set the tone of the day with a single declaration outside the bakery. If someone has taken the trouble to print such words, we are bound to see them carried out. At once, conversations turned to clues, motives, and the reliability of every neighbor's alibi. Some spoke of old feuds, others of betrayal dating back decades. A farmhand recalled a vanished heirloom once said to lie hidden in the manor walls. An elderly gardener whispered about a legacy disputed by distant relatives. Each rumor slithered through Elmridge, gathering details with each retelling. There was no longer a question of whether people would attend, but who among them might have reason to fear that night most. Outside the village shop, the air was heavy with the scent of freshly baked bread and the tension of unspoken suspicions. The butcher's wife noted the shadowy figure she had seen standing near White Willow's gates the night before. A telegram boy claimed he delivered a cryptic message to the manor just days earlier. Bits of information surfaced, like footsteps echoing through a long corridor. None clear on their own, each hinting at something yet unrevealed. At the heart of this mounting storm stood the manor itself, White Willows. Once the pride of the glen, its white stones were now veined with ivy, its windows half obscured by drapes drawn tight against prying eyes. The conservatory, where the mysterious event was scheduled, had been the setting for countless lavish gatherings, but never before had it been named the stage for such a chilling declaration. In the evenings leading up to Sunday, lights flickered on behind the manor's tall windows, casting faint glows across the gardens. Inside, unspoken conversations unfolded, hushed voices weaving stories of inheritance, old rivalries, and the possibility of an affair long kept secret. A diary found its way into trembling hands. An unopened telegram was rumored to hold answers to questions no one dared voice aloud. And yet, for every villager pressing their ear to keyholes or watching the gates from behind hedgerows, there were others who quietly retreated, haunted by the thought that the announcement was not a jest but a promise. Some double-locked their doors, afraid of being swept into something they could not explain. Others packed satchels for sudden departures, desperate to flee Elmridge before Sunday evening arrived. Yet none could deny the irresistible pull of the scheduled event. The very idea of it, the final hour declared in advance, the motive hidden in plain sight, the possibility of a twist no one yet imagined, spread like a secret only half-whispered, too tempting to resist. In those 4 days between the announcement and the appointed hour, the village held its breath, caught between the everyday rhythms of market stalls and church bells and the creeping certainty that something would happen when the clock struck 7 on Sunday night. As the sun rose on Thursday, 3 days before the promised event, the conversations in Elmridge shifted from hushed wonder to open speculation. By the fountain near the green, Mr. Horace Penbury, a solicitor with a fondness for other people's business, recounted every detail he remembered of White Willows Manor's history. His voice carried across the square tales of a long-ago inheritance dispute that had left the previous owner's family in bitter silence, rumors of a betrayal that had sent a young bride fleeing into the night. His audience grew with each retelling, until the cafe tables were crowded with villagers, leaning closer. A single question hung unspoken between them. If the announcement was real, who among them would have reason to fear it most? Even those who claimed indifference found themselves inventing excuses to pass near the manor gates. Children who once played marbles by the old church began daring each other to touch the rusted iron fence of White Willows, giggling nervously as if a single tap might trigger the clock toward the promised final hour. Inside White Willows itself, preparations took an unsettling turn. A deliver-man, eyes wide, swore to his mates he had seen candles being arranged in a perfect circle within the conservatory, their wicks unlit but ready. A maid from a neighboring estate whispered that she glimpsed a figure in a blue velvet robe, carrying a diary up the grand staircase, a detail repeated until it became fact. No one knew whose words were truth and whose were embellishment, yet each account folded into the larger mystery like pieces of a puzzle. Friday brought visitors from neighboring villages. Drawn by word of the printed announcement, they gathered at the village inn, comparing clues gleaned from old letters and cryptic remarks overheard in White Willows gardens. Among these visitors was a tall, thin man with eyes that missed nothing, Mr. Benedict Rowe, a retired barrister whose sharp mind and calm demeanor suggested a practiced listener rather than a gossip. He noted every whispered theory, every shadowy hint of scandal, and quietly compiled a list of names and motives. Each evening saw the village square flickering with lantern light and conversations that grew more urgent. A carpenter claimed he heard footsteps pacing the conservatory in the hours before dawn. A seamstress insisted she saw a glint of something metallic tucked into a lady's reticule, a legacy passed down, or perhaps an instrument of harm. As Saturday approached, invitations, real or imagined, became the talk of every home. Some claimed to have received telegrams summoning them to the conservatory on Sunday night. Others bragged of private notes slipped under their doors with instructions on where to stand when the clock struck 7. Whether these invitations were genuine or the inventions of desperate minds, no one could say, but they fanned the flames of anticipation until the air itself seemed heavy with unspoken warnings. That evening, the scent of night-blooming flowers drifted from the hedges around White Willows as villagers gathered at the gates. They peered through wrought iron bars at the locked room of the conservatory, its glass panes reflecting the last streaks of twilight. The sight of that silent room, waiting, seemed to chill every conversation into silence. In the corner of the square, Mr. Rowe adjusted his spectacles and murmured to a companion that there were two kinds of people in Elmridge now: those who feared what the announcement might reveal, and those who longed for it. As dawn broke on Saturday, the village awoke with the restless energy of a place holding its breath. Over cups of strong tea and quietly buttered toast, talk of Sunday's final hour eclipsed every other subject. The announcement had not faded from conversation. It had become the very heartbeat of Elmridge-on-Glen. Outside the grocer's shop, the familiar clang of the delivery bell was met not with cheerful greetings, but nervous glances. At the hairdresser's, elderly ladies, usually so quick to trade recipes, now exchanged theories with the intensity of conspirators plotting an escape. Each tidbit of gossip arrived wrapped in solemnity, an overheard confession, a cryptic exchange between strangers outside the post office, the sudden vanished presence of a housemaid who had left without collecting her wages. Meanwhile, inside White Willows Manor, the conservatory had taken on an almost sacred significance. Through its rippling glass walls, passers-by glimpsed shadows drifting between ferns and tall orchids. Some villagers swore the furniture had been rearranged since the previous afternoon, the chairs placed to form a semicircle around a single high-backed seat at the center of the room. Others whispered of flickering candlelight in the small hours, the glow of which suggested secret meetings unfolding beneath the manor's high ceilings. It was Saturday afternoon when Mrs. Prudence Whitlock, walking with a basket of lavender, spotted something that made her pause mid-step. A man in a dark coat standing motionless beyond the manor's gates. His gaze was fixed on the conservatory. She recognized him at once, Dr. Ambrose Linton, White Willow's new tenant, who had arrived barely 6 months earlier. Some described him as a gentleman of impressive education. Others suggested he carried the weight of a past he would rather forget. His arrival had been marked by a telegram arriving in the dead of night, followed by an abrupt silence about his reasons for renting the manor. In another corner of the village, Edith Bellamy, the baker's widow, found herself staring at a small velvet box she kept tucked beneath the floorboards, a gift she had once received from the previous owner of White Willows. It was an heirloom of uncertain value, and its existence was a secret she had kept for years. Now, with the announced event looming, she wondered if someone knew of it, and whether it could be the motive for Sunday's promised reckoning. By nightfall, visitors began arriving from surrounding towns, filling the village into capacity. The rooms buzzed with new rumors, that a diary detailing a long-hidden affair had been discovered in the attic, that a betrayal decades ago had sown hatred between two families whose descendants still lived side by side. These stories merged with older legends until every face in the village was a potential suspect, and every quiet nod a possible clue. As the church bell tolled 9, Mr. Benedict Rowe stood near the square's fountain, his notebook filled with names and observations. He noted the unspoken alliances forming between certain villagers, the sidelong glances exchanged by people who had once been friends. He watched as a small group of children ran past, shouting that they had seen something move in the conservatory, though whether it was a stray cat or a person, none could say. Above it all, the looming bulk of White Willows Manor remained silent, its windows reflecting the stars. The village settled into a restless sleep, each household counting the hours until Sunday night, each resident torn between dread and the irresistible pull of the event they could neither stop nor avoid. Chapter 2. The village of Elmridge-on-Glen. Sunday morning arrived on the heels of a restless night, each household stirring long before dawn, as though the village itself refused to sleep with the event approaching. The mist clung low across Elmridge-on-Glen, hugging every hedge and gate, softening the crooked lanes and ancient cottages until the world felt smaller, quieter, as if all sound were held in anticipation of the evening's promise. Every villager who stepped beyond their garden gate found themselves drawn toward the square at the heart of the glen, with the chipping Cleghorn tea rooms, the stone parish church of St. Elwyn, and the tiny grocer's, whose shelves bore tins older than many of its customers, formed the village's familiar triangle. There, conversations ran like rivulets along the cobblestones. Low, whispered exchanges about the announcement, suspicious glances cast across the square, and stray words such as inheritance, scandal, and confession slipping from tense lips. In this tight-knit place, every door had a history, every window a witness. The villagers, once content with the petty dramas of who pinched whose apples or who forgot the harvest fair, now measured each other's words for signs of deception. Those who had spent decades as friendly neighbors eyed one another like potential suspects, their minds turning over old slights and quiet grudges. The heart of the growing tension stood White Willows Manor, its tall gates a mute sentinel at the western edge of Elmridge. A wrought-iron sign bearing the manor's name hung from an arched entryway, creaking with each morning gust. The conservatory, a grand glass room sprouting from the manor's rear like a crystal bloom, loomed large in every mind, the chosen stage for the night's event. Its walls glittered faintly beneath dawn's weak light, hiding the secrets within. Between the square and the manor sprawled Fletcher's Green, a small public park ringed with benches where children once flew kites and old men played chess. Today, the benches were occupied by villagers exchanging cryptic theories, each account more detailed than the last. One man claimed the printed announcement must have come from a scorned lover bent on revenge. Another swore he saw a telegram delivered to the manor bearing foreign stamps. Each retelling layered the mystery thicker than the morning fog. On Hemsley Lane, the village's oldest row of cottages lined a narrow path just wide enough for a cart. Doors here bore brass knockers polished every Sunday, lace curtains barely fluttering with the movement of watchers within. In these houses, tales of vanished family fortunes and long-ago affairs resurfaced. Stories once buried beneath polite smiles, now disinterred by the promise of an evening that would either prove or shatter every whispered suspicion. The King's Arms, Elmridge's solitary pub, stood at the far end of the lane, its sign depicting a faded lion rearing on hind legs. By midday, the oak-paneled taproom was thick with speculation. Tankards sat untouched as villagers debated who might possess an unspoken motive, whose alibi seemed too rehearsed, who had reason to fear that the appointed hour could bring old secrets roaring to life. Even the parish church of St. Elwyn, usually a refuge of certainty, found its pews filled with restless minds. The vicar's Sunday sermon faltered beneath the weight of shifting glances and fidgeting hands. Parishioners no longer prayed for harvests or good weather. They prayed to remain unseen, untouched by whatever revelation or reckoning the evening would bring. Every path, every threshold in Elmridge felt charged with possibility. Each corner carried the muffled echo of footsteps belonging to villagers who might be friend or foe. And above all, the locked room of the conservatory waited, quiet and inscrutable, holding a promise that would soon demand fulfillment. As the village's restless murmur spread beneath the pale morning sky, its focus shifted from the conservatory itself to those who might have cause to fear or welcome the appointed hour. The residents of Elmridge-on-Glen, once content to wave politely from garden gates, now found themselves subject to probing stares and hushed assessments of their every word. At the center of this swirling suspicion stood Dr. Ambrose Linton, White Willow's elusive tenant. His tall figure appeared briefly at the manor's window before vanishing into shadows, leaving villagers to debate his past with mounting fervor. Some recalled his arrival in a black motor car late one rainy night. Others spoke of a telegram he received days later that had left him white-knuckled and mute for hours. His eyes, when glimpsed in the village, carried the look of a man who had known betrayal. Next came Edith Bellamy, the baker's widow whose warm loaves had fed 3 generations, but whose reserved demeanor invited speculation. Whispers told of a legacy passed to her from the manor's prior owner, a gift she never declared to the taxman or her closest friends. Each sidelong glance she cast toward the manor gates fed the rumor that her quiet life concealed a dangerous confession waiting to surface. On the eastern edge of the village, in a rose-covered cottage, lived Miss Cordelia Fairley, a spinster of exacting manners and an eye for gossip. Cordelia's life was a tangle of unspoken vendettas and wounded pride. Once promised marriage to a man who instead wed another, she carried the burden of that scandal with bitterness disguised as courtesy. Her precise memory of family trees and financial ties made her both a valued source of knowledge and a dangerous observer. The village's only young married couple, Patrick and Viola Hemsworth, found themselves drawn unwillingly into the swirling drama. Patrick, a schoolteacher admired for his patience with children, hid a history of gambling debts that led some to question whether his recent good fortune had been built on someone else's misfortune. Viola, delicate and sharp-eyed, nursed a private diary that many speculated contained stories of her husband's past, stories that could become a powerful motive. Then there was Mrs. Prudence Whitlock, who had long appointed herself the village's moral compass. Though elderly, she maintained a sharpness of mind that made her words as cutting as any blade. It was Prudence who insisted that every soul in Elmridge had a secret worth fearing, and who claimed in hushed tones over tea that the timing of the announcement matched the anniversary of a vanished maid's disappearance from White Willows decades ago. The final member of this small constellation was Henry Calthorpe, the stooped village bookseller whose kindly eyes belied a fierce protectiveness over his adopted daughter, Miriam. Though he had lived peacefully among his neighbors for 40 years, recent weeks had seen him meeting strangers outside the train station, strangers whose visits he refused to explain. Some wondered if Henry's soft voice and worn tweeds masked a double existence, a double life that might unravel if the Conservatory's event exposed old lies. Around these figures swirled the village's speculation, their names repeated with growing certainty in parlors and pub corners. Each possessed means, opportunity, or a lingering grievance. Each inspired arguments about who most deserved to be called a suspect. As church bells rang noon, the village square grew busy with the convergence of these lives. Neighbors pretended to examine tomatoes at the market stall while listening for snatches of conversation. Stray mentions of inheritance, overheard whispered apologies, or a hastily concealed letter provided villagers with enough threads to weave elaborate tapestries of guilt and deception. By day's end, it was no longer a question of whether something extraordinary would occur in the conservatory that night, but how many secrets would burst into daylight before the clock struck 7. As Sunday afternoon crept toward evening, the stillness of Elmridge-on-Glen grew thick with expectation. The village's usual routines fell away. Children who might have skipped stones by the stream hovered instead near fences, listening to the grown-ups. Housewives who once shared sponge cake recipes now exchanged theories, thick with fear. Men who pretended indifference were seen walking routes that passed White Willows Manor more than once. Every conversation revolved around the same question. If the announcement foretold a final hour, whose secrets would it drag from the shadows first? At the King's Arms, tension built with each tick of the grandfather clock that dominated the oak-paneled room. Villagers gathered in tense clusters, some gripping tankards, others clutching letters they refused to read aloud. The air crackled with unspoken suspicions, each conversation ending abruptly when a new figure entered. Old alliances shifted as quickly as the clouds above the village green, friendships tested by the need to know who had received an invitation to the conservatory and who had not. In the small parlor of Edith Bellamy, hushed visitors came and went, faces pale, eyes darting to the curtained window. Some left clutching envelopes, marked with the manor's crest, their contents never shared. Others departed empty-handed, their disappointment only feeding the village's churning rumors. Edith herself paced her parlor, recalling the heirloom hidden beneath the loose floorboard, an object she once considered protection, now a burden heavier than stone. Meanwhile, Miss Cordelia fairly appeared in the square, her gloved hands folded over a letter she refused to open. Those who approached her were met with a frozen smile. Her sharp gaze scanned every passerby, as if weighing the likelihood that someone knew the truth behind her decades-old heartbreak. Cordelia's mere presence radiated certainty that the village's carefully constructed facade was days or hours from crumbling. Near the edge of the village, the once unremarkable figure of Henry Calthorpe took on a new gravity. Seen meeting Dr. Linton in the churchyard, their conversation ended with both men departing in opposite directions, faces drawn tight. Watching from a hedgerow, a pair of boys swore they heard the words betrayal and revenge drift across the graves. When their account reached the village green, it was recounted with hushed reverence, as if it contained the key to every question hanging over Elmridge. Each of these encounters wound threads of suspicion tighter around the conservatory at White Willows. Through its glass walls, figures moved like shadows, sometimes glimpsed arranging chairs, sometimes appearing in conversation only to slip away before details could be discerned. From certain angles, villagers claimed to see footsteps tracked in the dust along the conservatory floor, evidence of late-night visitors whose identities no one could confirm. The tension of these final hours seeped into every cobblestone and shuttered window. Even the ancient clock tower seemed to tick louder than ever, marking each minute with a sound that set hearts pounding. As sunset flared against the conservatory's glass dome, the village exhaled as one. The time for speculation had passed. Whatever had been planned was now beyond stopping, and every villager understood that when the hour arrived, the truth would walk among them, as certain and unstoppable as the tolling of the bell. Chapter 3. The Guests Assemble. As the final rays of sunlight melted behind White Willows Manor, the village of Elmridge-on-Glen grew hushed, as if the earth itself were bracing for the appointed hour. Candles burned low in cottage windows. Conversations dwindled to tight-lipped exchanges. Along the lane leading to the manor gates, footsteps fell with deliberate care as villagers began to gather for the event that had consumed every thought and whisper since the announcement. First to arrive was Letitia Blackthorne, the current mistress of White Willows Manor, a woman whose gracious words and practiced smiles had charmed Elmridge for years. She glided across the conservatory's tiled floor, her eyes betraying a flicker of something only those watching closely might catch. Her name carried weight, her invitations, the unspoken power to include or exclude. Yet those who knew Letitia best wondered whether her generosity masked a private confession tied to the manor's legacy. Trailing Letitia came Dora, Bunny Mowbray, her childhood companion. Bunny moved with the distracted air of one carrying a mind cluttered by old memories and quiet regrets. Her tendency to repeat stories about the past, stories that often shifted in the details, led many to suspect she knew more than she realized, or that a single careless word from her might expose an uncomfortable truth. In recent days, Bunny had been seen lingering near the conservatory, eyes darting as if fearing her own unspoken recollections. A sudden gust along the path announced the arrival of Patrick and Julia Simmons, Letitia's young cousins whose charm cloaked their restlessness. Patrick's easy laughter won over many, but older villagers remembered unpaid bills and rumors of a double life in London. Julia, quick-witted and elegant, maintained a near-constant watch over her brother's dealings. She was observed retrieving a telegram from the post office the morning after the announcement, a message she did not share, fueling speculation about what secrets its cryptic lines contained. Hovering at the edge of the gathering stood Mitzi, Letitia's new maid, a figure who inspired both sympathy and suspicion. An outsider by accent and bearing, Mitzi had confided in hushed tones of past employers who had treated her with cruelty. Some pitied her. Others questioned whether her fears were born from experience or the burden of a secret she was desperate to hide. More than one villager noted Mitzi's tendency to slip into rooms unannounced, her presence as fleeting as a passing shadow. A few steps behind, Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd made their entrance, walking with the brisk confidence of women who considered themselves guardians of Elmridge's moral fiber. These long-time companions shared everything: their sharp eyes, their observations of neighbors' habits, and a taste for solving others' puzzles. Together, they watched each guest with the focused patience of gardeners tending delicate roses, noting every shift in expression, every sign of deception, every misplaced word that could prove a vital clue. From the village square arrived Inspector Lionel Cray, an investigator invited by Letitia herself to lend an air of authority to the evening. His keen eyes scanned the gathering with professional calm, but villagers sensed his confidence frayed by the strangeness of the event. For all his training, the inspector struggled to reconcile the calculated announcement with the gentle facades of those assembled. Whispers spread that he had already asked uncomfortable questions about old property disputes and inheritance matters. And then, almost imperceptibly, Miss Margaret Temple, the village's quietest resident, appeared on the threshold. Known for her unassuming nature and kindly smiles, Miss Temple was rarely the subject of gossip. Yet those paying attention could not ignore her sudden, intense interest in the conservatory's layout, or her pointed questions about who had keys to the manor's locked room. Some speculated her demure presence was the perfect facade for a mind capable of meticulous plans. As these figures coalesced within the conservatory's glass walls, the sense of anticipation grew so taut it threatened to snap. Conversations dropped to whispers as eyes shifted from one guest to another, minds racing through every rumor and remembered slight. Each villager found themselves trapped in the knowledge that in this room, beneath the pale glow of lanterns, stood every piece needed to solve a puzzle that had yet to fully reveal itself. As the heavy doors of the conservatory closed behind the last arrival, an unsettling quiet settled over the room. The flickering lanterns cast soft pools of light on polished tiles, revealing polished wooden chairs arranged in a loose semicircle. Guests exchanged hesitant nods, their footsteps echoing softly in the vaulted space. The stillness amplified every cough, every rustle of silk, every whispered question. Letitia Blackthorne stepped forward to greet each guest with gracious, careful words, but her eyes moved constantly, lingering a second too long on Patrick and Julia, flitting back to Mitzi as the maid hovered near the doors. Mitzi's restless fingers twisted the hem of her apron. When asked if she had seen anyone near the conservatory overnight, she paused a heartbeat too long, then offered a polite denial that satisfied no one. The delay itself planted a fresh seed of suspicion. Near a table laden with decanters of sherry and small plates of tarts, Inspector Cray began a quiet conversation with Miss Hinchcliffe. Their words carried just far enough for others to catch fragments. Alibi, inheritance, telegram. These words, drifting across the room like drifting smoke, drew sidelong glances from nearly every guest. Each word invited new questions about how the evening would unfold. Meanwhile, Bunny Mowbray had settled herself near a potted palm, her wide eyes flitting nervously from face to face. She spoke to no one directly, but those who drifted near heard her muttering of a diary she once kept, one filled with details she worried might now be used against her. Some wondered if her rambling words were the anxious ramblings of a harmless old friend, or the unintentional confession of someone carrying knowledge worth vanishing over. Patrick and Julia remained close together, their posture outwardly relaxed yet betraying an undercurrent of unease. Julia's keen gaze swept the guests with a practiced calm that contrasted sharply with Patrick's forced laughter. A few minutes before the clock in the hall chimed 6, Patrick slipped a folded paper from his coat pocket, his fingers smoothing its creases as though it contained instructions vital to the night's outcome. Julia noticed, but said nothing, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly. From her vantage near the conservatory's tall windows, Miss Margaret Temple took in each gesture, each half-finished sentence, with the quiet concentration of one who missed nothing. Her unassuming exterior shielded a mind already mapping connections, filing away every odd glance, every slip of the tongue. When Inspector Cray excused himself to check the manor's corridors, Miss Temple's gaze followed him to the doors, noting that Mitzi hurriedly stepped away at the same moment, disappearing down the shadowed hall with barely a whisper of footsteps. The gentle clink of a dropped glass shattered the hush. All eyes turned to Mrs. Whitlock, who had moved to the far corner of the conservatory. Her face flushed as she insisted it was nothing, yet the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. A clue lay somewhere in that moment, a hint of a truth she fought to keep buried, perhaps tied to the heirloom she once boasted about but never displayed. As the guests resumed their uncertain conversations, the conservatory's glass walls, darkening with the approach of night, reflected faces drawn taut with expectation. In those reflections, every guest saw not only themselves, but the web of doubt that now bound them all. The hours of whispered rumors and hushed questions had carried them to this exact moment, and though no word had yet confirmed what might come, each person knew in their bones that secrets were perched on the edge of exposure. Outside, the bells of St. Elwyn tolled 6 o'clock, their deep tones rippling across Elmridge. The guests glanced upward as if the sound might split the very air, each chime a reminder that the final hour was near, and that once the clock reached 7, there would be no turning back. The final chimes of 6 o'clock had barely faded when a hush fell, so complete it seemed the conservatory itself held its breath. Candle flames shivered in the cooling air. The guests shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the tall clock in the corner and each other's guarded faces. With every tick, the sense of something imminent pressed tighter against them all. Letitia Blackthorne cleared her throat and raised her voice, welcoming everyone with a measured calm that only highlighted the tension rippling beneath her words. She thanked each guest for honoring her invitation, though none missed the careful emphasis on the word invitation, a word that carried as many unspoken accusations as polite intentions. A sudden whispered exchange near the conservatory's door drew every gaze. Mitzi had reappeared, her hair slightly askew, eyes darting like a sparrow's. She clutched a crumpled scrap of paper, refusing to say who had given it to her or what it contained. Some guests pressed her for answers, but she backed against the glass wall, lips trembling with a fear that set fresh suspicions alight across the room. From the far side of the gathering, Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd kept a running tally of every discrepancy they observed. The unexplained absence of Patrick moments before 6, the faint scent of something bitter on Bunny's shawl hinting at poison, the slight bulge in Julia's reticule large enough to hide a small box or folded letter. Their eyes swept the conservatory with the cold precision of seasoned observers, missing nothing. Inspector Cray's face grew more pinched with each passing minute. He moved from guest to guest, his quiet questions turning sharper as he pressed for details. Where each had been during the afternoon, what messages they received, who had approached them with suggestions to leave or stay. The words motive and alibi hung heavy in the air, each question seeding more unease. Meanwhile, Miss Margaret Temple's stillness belied the racing calculations behind her calm eyes. She caught sight of Bunny clutching her bag as if it contained the village's darkest secrets, and noted the sudden flush in Letitia's cheeks when the word inheritance floated from Inspector Cray's lips. As the minute hand of the clock crept closer to 7, Miss Temple's mind knitted stray threads into patterns that others could not yet see. Near the conservatory entrance, Patrick reappeared with a stiff smile that convinced no one. His shirt collar sat crooked, his hair ruffled. Julia's eyes widened at his return, but she said nothing, her hand instead brushing against her reticule with subtle urgency. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on Patrick's brow. His eyes flicked to the clock as though measuring each remaining second. Then, from somewhere within the manor, came the unmistakable creak of floorboards, too heavy and deliberate to be explained away as the settling of old timbers. Every head turned in unison toward the conservatory doors, the silence inside the glass walls turning sharper than any blade. The sound of footsteps, slow and measured, drifted closer until it halted just beyond the doors. In that charged pause, the clock's ticking grew louder, each tick counting down to the moment they all feared or awaited. Faces shifted from pale to ashen, eyes wide and unblinking. The promise of the final hour had become more than a curiosity. It had become a certainty none could deny. Each person present felt it in their bones. The answers to every whispered rumor, every secret, every old wound were about to step into the lantern light. And outside, as the first stars blinked in the sky above Elmridge, the manor gate stood open to the night, a silent invitation to the truth waiting inside the conservatory. Chapter 4. The Hour of Shadows. The conservatory clock struck 7 with a series of deep, resonant chimes that rolled across White Willows Manor and the hushed village beyond. The sound seemed to hang in the still air, each note a tolling reminder that the moment Elmridge had dreaded and anticipated had finally arrived. A single candle sputtered near the arched doors, casting shifting patterns across the guests' faces. Then, without warning, The lanterns lining the conservatory walls flickered wildly before extinguishing in unison, plunging the room into darkness, so complete it swallowed every detail. Gasps rippled through the gathering. The scrape of a chair rang out, followed by hurried footsteps crossing the tiled floor. Someone muttered a strangled protest. A sharp sound like breaking glass cracked the hush, and then a sudden, deafening bang shattered the silence, reverberating through the glass walls. Cries erupted from every corner of the conservatory. In the chaos, shadows collided and bodies brushed past one another in a confusion of panicked movement. The smell of spent powder drifted through the air, acrid and unmistakable. Guests clutched each other or staggered for the walls, their voices rising in frightened fragments. "Who was that? What's happened? Where is everyone?" A second bang rang out, closer this time, more jarring, followed by a heavy thud as something fell against a table, sending a stack of silver plates clattering to the floor. In the darkness, the word murderous was whispered in a raw, terrified tone. A window pane rattled with a gust of wind, amplifying the sense of helpless confusion. Then, as abruptly as they had died, the lanterns sparked to life once more. Their glow spilled across the room, revealing a tableau frozen in horror. Chairs overturned, drinks spilled across the mosaic floor, faces wide-eyed and pale. At the center of it all lay a masked figure sprawled across the tiled floor, one hand outstretched toward the guests as if reaching for help or accusing them all. The mask, once black and featureless, now glistened wetly. The man's clothing and ill-fitting suit was unfamiliar to many present, and his face, once the mask was pulled away by Inspector Cray with trembling hands, revealed a countenance few recognized, but one or two guests gasped in recognition nonetheless. A clue glinted in the lantern light, a gold pocket watch lying just beyond the figure's hand. Its crystal cracked, its hand stopped precisely at 7 o'clock. Cray's eyes darted to the shattered watch, then to the faces of the guests, searching for the first flicker of deception or the faintest smile that might betray an unspoken motive. Mitzi shrank against the wall, her face ashen. Bunny wept openly, muttering about old debts and inheritance squabbles that should have remained buried. Patrick steadied himself against a table, his eyes fixed on the mask with a look of mingled fear and something deeper, perhaps recognition or regret. Julia, pale but composed, stepped forward to peer at the fallen man, then quickly averted her eyes. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her reticule. Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd exchanged a meaningful glance, each silently weighing who among them had most to gain from the night's horrifying climax. Inspector Cray's voice cut through the confusion with quiet authority. He ordered the doors locked, transforming the conservatory into a locked room of secrets where no one could leave and every soul present might be a suspect. His words fell like a hammer. "Until we understand what has happened here, we remain together." The guests stood in tense silence, hearts hammering as they waited for anyone, to offer an explanation. But no one spoke, and the only sound was the quiet ticking of the shattered pocket watch that marked the hour of shadows in Elmridge-on-Glen. The silence inside the conservatory stretched, heavy as stone. Each tick of the broken pocket watch on the floor echoed in the minds of the gathered guests. Inspector Cray's eyes moved deliberately from face to face, as if measuring every tremor, every glance. His voice, low but unwavering, cut through the hush. "Who among you knows this man?" A long beat passed before Letitia Blackthorne lifted her chin, voice carefully composed. "I have never seen him before tonight." Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flicked momentarily to Patrick, a fleeting movement that did not escape Miss Margaret Temple's sharp gaze. Miss Hinchcliffe's voice rose next, edged with disbelief. "And we're expected to believe a stranger burst into our gathering, only to meet this end." She swept the room with eyes keen enough to slice through the polite facades each guest struggled to maintain. From the doorway, Mitzi let out a quiet sob. Through hiccuped words, she insisted she had glimpsed the masked figure moving near the manor kitchens hours before the guests arrived. Her story faltered, restarted, twisted into a new shape, each revision planting fresh suspicions in every listener's mind. Inspector Cray pressed her for details, but her answers grew more tangled, leaving a trail of red herrings rather than clarity. Near the overturned chairs, Bunny's trembling hands fumbled with a handkerchief. Between shuddering breaths, she mumbled of a telegram delivered to White Willows earlier that day, addressed only to the lady of the manor, a cryptic missive that she claimed carried a veiled threat. Though she insisted she hadn't read it fully, her eyes darted to Letitia with a guilt that spoke volumes. Julia stepped forward to retrieve the fallen gold pocket watch, but Inspector Cray's hand shot out, stopping her. "No one touches anything," he commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "This watch may hold a clue more valuable than you realize." He crouched to study its cracked face, noting aloud how the stopped hands matched precisely the appointed hour, suggesting a plan executed with meticulous timing. Meanwhile, Patrick hovered by the fireplace, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. He bristled when Inspector Cray asked his whereabouts during the moments before the lights went out, offering an alibi that sounded rehearsed. His sister Julia flinched at the tone of his reply, a fleeting sign of unease. From her seat at the conservatory's edge, Miss Margaret Temple observed it all in silence, her mind sorting every fractured sentence and every shift of posture. She noted Bunny's mention of old inheritance disputes, Mitzi's disjointed accounts of footsteps in the hall, and Patrick's evasive glances toward the conservatory doors. Every fragment hinted at a pattern, one hidden beneath layers of polite conversation and half-remembered slights. In the room's farthest corner, Mrs. Whitlock moved to pour herself a glass of sherry with hands that trembled just enough to spill a thin stream onto the floor. She caught Inspector Cray's gaze and offered a tight smile. "Nerves, Inspector," she whispered, but the sharp scent of sherry mingled with the air of tension, the room a brew of shifting alliances and smoldering secrets. As the clock outside told 7:15, the guests realized the night had changed forever. The once cozy conservatory had become a crucible of doubt, each guest weighed down by the knowledge that someone among them carried the truth of what had transpired, and that every unspoken word, every hurried glance now mattered more than ever. As the clock ticked past 20 minutes after 7, the air in the conservatory thickened with unvoiced accusations. The guests shifted restlessly in their chairs, each afraid to meet another's eyes for too long. Inspector Cray stepped to the center of the room, the masked man's body at his feet like an unspoken threat, and began his questioning in earnest. His gaze settled first on Julia. He asked what business could have brought her near the conservatory's service doors that afternoon, when she was seen in hushed conversation with Mitzi. Julia's voice, smooth but strained, offered an explanation of misplaced keys. Yet the faint quaver in her tone suggested a deception that did not go unnoticed by Miss Hinchcliffe, who leaned forward to catch every word. From the edge of the group, Bunny piped up with a shaky recollection of hearing a man's voice calling her name outside her window the previous night, a detail that sent a ripple of unease through the guests. Inspector Cray pressed her for specifics, but her memory wavered between certainty and confusion, turning her account into another red herring that muddied more than it clarified. Mitzi, eyes wide with terror, insisted once more that she had glimpsed a shadowy figure slipping into the conservatory long before the guests gathered. Yet each time Inspector Cray asked for a clear description, her words shifted. She described a tall man, then a woman with a veil, then someone short and hunched. Every revision drew sharper frowns from those gathered, who began to wonder whether Mitzi's panic hid a guilty conscience, or whether she was simply overwhelmed by a storm of old fears. As Letitia Blackthorne listened to these accounts, she moved a hand to her brooch, fingers tracing its edges with a care that looked more like worry than absent-mindedness. Inspector Cray noticed her gesture and asked softly whether the brooch had any special significance. Letitia's eyes flashed for the briefest moment before she replied that it was merely an heirloom, passed from mother to daughter, but her voice betrayed a catch that made several guests glance sideways. Miss Margaret Temple, her eyes glinting with quiet calculation, noticed a smudge of what looked like fresh soil on Patrick's right cuff. Her mind connected this to the earlier sighting of Patrick disappearing through the garden moments before the lights failed. But before she could speak, Inspector Cray's attention snapped to the fireplace where a folded slip of paper caught in the grate's ironwork. He retrieved it carefully, unfolding it to reveal lines of cryptic text. All debts end at 7. The past repaid. The future secured. The message fell like a stone into the still room. A cold dread spread as each guest realized the words could mean ruin for anyone with an old affair, secret motive, or family betrayal. The note's meaning was tantalizingly close, yet refused to settle into a single truth. Was it a confession, a threat, or the final warning of someone desperate to settle scores before they lost everything? Inspector Cray read the note twice more, eyes narrowing. "Someone in this room wrote these words," he declared, his tone low but certain. He laid the slip on the table for all to see. And until we learn who, we cannot trust a single alibi or explanation offered tonight. In the tense silence that followed, the only sound was the faint drip of spilled sherry trickling from the table's edge onto the conservatory floor. A delicate, relentless beat counting out the seconds until the first person's courage, or desperation, finally broke. Chapter 5. Questions and Contradictions. The conservatory's atmosphere shifted in the minutes after Inspector Cray declared his intention to find the author of the cryptic note. Silence fractured into restless shuffles and half-finished words, each guest weighing what to reveal and what to conceal before Cray's piercing gaze reached them. The inspector began his interviews with Letitia Blackthorne, whose composure showed the first fine cracks of strain. He asked where she was during the blackout. She described stepping near the conservatory's central lantern to steady herself. Yet her account wavered under careful questioning. Cray noted the inconsistencies with deliberate calm, adding each one to a mental ledger of clues that suggested her movements might not align with innocence. Bunny Mowbray's turn came next. Her hands fidgeted with a silver locket that caught the lantern's glow. When asked about the telegram she mentioned, her story tangled quickly. She insisted she hadn't read it fully, then said she had, then claimed she burned it without telling anyone. Each correction set a new wave of doubt rippling across the guests, and her flustered face suggested she was battling a storm of unspoken truths she could no longer keep straight. Patrick and Julia stood together when questioned, but even Inspector Cray could see they were anything but united. Julia's voice was steady as she recounted the hours before the gathering, yet she hesitated when pressed on Patrick's whereabouts during the conservatory's blackout. Patrick, for his part, gave curt answers, eyes fixed on the broken pocket watch still lying where it had fallen. Cray observed the tension between them with keen interest, their strained closeness a tapestry of potential motive, fear, or both. Mitzi stood wringing her hands so tightly they blanched white. When asked about her sighting of the shadowy figure, she described a silhouette near the conservatory's side entrance, but shifted details with each retelling. The height changed, the gait altered, the direction reversed. Each inconsistency left guests glancing nervously at one another, wondering whether her confusion was genuine terror or a deliberate fog of deception. Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd proved more willing to share their observations, each offering a steady stream of details about who spoke to whom, which chairs had been moved, who had appeared near the conservatory doors at critical moments. But their accounts also introduced a thicket of contradictions. One insisted Julia and Patrick were apart when the lanterns flickered. The other swore they were side by side. Cray's notebook grew heavy with red herrings, the careful record of words that clarified little, but deepened the sense that the room was a stage set for betrayal. Through it all, Miss Margaret Temple watched in silence from her seat near the potted ferns. Her sharp eyes noted every slip of the tongue, every darting glance. She alone saw Bunny's startled reaction when Letitia mentioned the inheritance dispute that had split the manor's former owners. She alone caught Patrick's expression tightening at the mention of a diary that might still exist somewhere in White Willow's many rooms. Inspector Cray shifted the questioning to the moment the lanterns died. He asked each guest, "Where were you standing? Who was closest to the masked man? Whose voice did you hear shouting first?" The replies formed a tangled skein of truth and contradiction, with more than one guest claiming to have seen Mitzi near the center of the room, and others swearing she was by the doors. Every answer added to the labyrinth Cray faced. Yet it was precisely in these tangled statements that the first clues emerged. The timing of the footsteps, the order of voices raised in panic, the subtle movement of shadows cast by a single, flickering lantern before it died. And in the quiet spaces between questions, Miss Temple quietly assembled a theory of her own, piecing together every flicker of fear and every shifting alibi, certain that if she could understand who truly saw what in those chaotic moments, the truth of the final hour would reveal itself at last. As Inspector Cray moved among the guests, the conservatory's lanterns glowed low, their soft light pooling around nervous faces. Each question he asked seemed to slice deeper into the comfortable veneer that had long held Elmridge-on-Glen together, exposing tensions older than anyone dared admit. The inspector returned to Bunny, this time with a new edge to his voice. He asked directly whether she recognized the masked man. Her hands trembled as she denied knowing him, but her eyes darted toward Letitia Blackthorne, a fleeting glance so sharp it might have been invisible to most. Yet Miss Margaret Temple, sitting in her quiet corner, saw it with crystal clarity, and knew in that instant there was a link between Bunny's fear and Letitia's carefully measured calm. Cray shifted his focus to the items on the tables around the conservatory, an overturned chair, a silver cigarette case lying open, its contents scattered, and the cracked pocket watch ticking out a useless rhythm. He asked each guest if they owned the cigarette case, but all disavowed it. Patrick's eyes, however, lingered a second too long on the engraved initials hidden inside the lid, and when Cray noted his gaze, Patrick's face flushed with a heat that spoke volumes. Mitzi's answers grew more erratic under repeated questioning. She insisted the masked man had vanished before the second gunshot, contradicting her earlier claim of seeing him fall. Each time she stumbled, Miss Hinchcliffe's eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, as if adding a tally mark against Mitzi's account with every inconsistency. A whispered comment passed from Miss Murgatroyd to Miss Hinchcliffe. "She's either terrified beyond reason or weaving the finest deception I've ever heard." Inspector Cray paused near the conservatory's grand lamp, a towering brass fixture whose heavy shade had rattled during the blackout. He tapped it lightly, causing the guests to jump at the hollow sound. "Someone tampered with this lamp," he said. "The cord was cut almost through. It was meant to fail precisely at 7. A fresh wave of dread rippled through the room. The cut cord suggested premeditation of the most deliberate kind, and someone in the room had counted on darkness to hide their movements. As he spoke, Cray's eyes flicked to the doorway, where muddy prints marred the threshold. His voice softened as he called attention to them. "One pair of these footprints matches none of your shoes," he said quietly. "Did someone here change their footwear after the blackout, or did someone else slip into the conservatory unseen?" Gasps circled the room as minds raced through every possibility, each guest re-examining every face in the lamplight. Miss Margaret Temple rose from her chair at last, her gaze traveling slowly across the guests. She spoke softly, but her words carried a quiet authority that hushed the room. "We've all been watching each other so closely that we've missed something simple," she said. "This wasn't only about who was where, but who was expected to be where, and who used that expectation to move freely. Her words cast a spell of sudden realization. The careful arrangements of chairs, the guests' assigned seats, the pretext of invitations, who had known who would sit where, and who had a chance to slip into shadows unnoticed. The idea took root instantly, sending eyes darting across the room, each guest silently reevaluating the night with a new, sharper lens. And in that restless quiet, Inspector Cray's next question fell like the tolling of a bell. "Which of you has been lying about when you entered the conservatory tonight?" The question hung heavy in the conservatory's hush. "Which of you has been lying about when you entered the conservatory tonight?" Inspector Cray's eyes swept the room with unflinching intensity, pausing just long enough on each guest to turn silence into confession. Patrick's lips parted as if to speak, but Julia's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a subtle desperation that did not go unnoticed. Cray's eyes narrowed on the siblings. "You two arrived together," he said evenly, "but neither of your stories places you in the same part of the room when the lights failed. Explain that." Julia's breath caught audibly, and Patrick's face turned a deeper shade of red. Miss Hinchcliffe, emboldened by the inspector's bluntness, stood to address the room herself. Her words were sharp as she recounted seeing Bunny approach the conservatory alone, several minutes before the appointed hour. "She told me she was fetching her shawl," Hinchcliffe declared, voice rising. "But why would she do so before the rest of us were even called in?" Bunny's face drained of color. Her voice cracked as she denied it, but her protest sounded hollow to every ear. Mitzi let out a quiet whimper, pressing her back against the glass walls. She whispered that she had heard footsteps in the corridor outside just as the lights died. Footsteps, she swore, did not match anyone in the room. Her account shifted once more, sowing confusion. Was she genuinely terrified, or planting stories to cover her own tracks? Inspector Cray's brow furrowed deeper with every word she spoke. Cray turned abruptly to Letitia, his voice low but edged with steel. "You alone had the keys to the conservatory's locked room, did you not?" he asked. Letitia's fingers clenched around the hem of her sleeve. Her eyes flicked toward the fallen pocket watch, then back to Cray, as if weighing what could be said without inviting ruin. "Yes," she admitted at last, her voice brittle. I was the only one with a key, but I never left it unattended." The words rang with an unsteady finality that left the room unconvinced. As the inspector questioned each guest, Miss Margaret Temple moved quietly around the perimeter, studying every object out of place. She paused near the grand lamp, eyes lingering on a faint smear of wax on the table beneath. She lifted the cloth carefully, revealing a small brass button caught in the threads. Her heart quickened, a clue so easily overlooked in the chaos. She tucked it into her pocket, determined to study it when fewer eyes were watching. In the midst of Cray's interrogation, a hush fell as the wind gusted outside, rattling the conservatory's glass panes. The lantern flames wavered, shadows dancing across the guests' faces. In those shifting patterns, fear and calculation played in every glance. Bunny's wild eyes darting, Patrick's clenched jaw, Mitzi's hunched posture, Letitia's fragile poise. And still the inspector pressed on, knowing the tangled web of alibis could not hold forever. "One of you stood near the masked man when the first gunshot rang out," he said, voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "One of you had time, motive, and the perfect opportunity to turn the blackout into a scene of terror." The words left a ringing silence in their wake, a silence that deepened as each guest realized the fragile trust holding them together was now cracking, each fissure threatening to expose secrets far older and far more dangerous than the events of a single night. Chapter 6. The Doubled Life. The conservatory's lanterns burned lower, their faint light catching the hard glint in Inspector Cray's eyes as he stood before the group. His voice, quiet but unyielding, broke the uneasy silence. "I believe the masked man knew something no one else dared to say, Something about the true identity of someone standing here tonight. A ripple of unease passed through the room, a subtle shudder that traveled from guest to guest. Miss Margaret Temple's eyes sharpened, her gaze shifting to Letitia Blackthorne. She noticed a tremor beneath Letitia's calm surface, like a taut string quivering before it snaps. Cray continued, recounting every detail gleaned from hours of questioning, the precise moment the lantern flickered, the footsteps heard by Mitzi, the shifted positions of chairs, the muddied prints no one had claimed. Each fact formed a constellation pointing toward one impossible conclusion. He spoke of the heirloom brooch Letitia wore, an antique piece with a hidden compartment. As Cray held it aloft, he revealed a tiny scrap of parchment tucked inside, ink-faded but legible enough to carry a single name, Charlotte Blackthorne. The name fell into the room like a stone into a still pond, sending silent ripples of shock across every face. Letitia's breath came faster, her eyes darting to Bunny, to Julia, and then to Cray himself. "There is no Charlotte here," she said, voice tight and strained. But Cray pressed on, his words unspooling the secrets that had lain buried for years. How the real Letitia had vanished years before White Willow's current owner appeared. How the estate's inheritance line depended on Letitia's presence. How only Charlotte, Letitia's reclusive sister, had both the motive and opportunity to assume her identity. Miss Hinchcliffe's sharp voice cut the silence. "You mean we've been living beside a ghost all these years?" The disbelief in her tone matched the horror spreading across the guests. Bunny's mouth fell open, but no words emerged, only a strangled gasp of recognition. Cray described the evidence uncovered in the Manor's diary, hidden in a false panel behind the library shelves, its entries revealing Charlotte's gradual assumption of her sister's life, her confession of forging signatures, details of Charlotte learning Letitia's voice, gestures, even memories, and fears of being recognized by those who knew the real Letitia best. Mitzi began to sob, recalling how she once glimpsed Miss Letitia pacing late at night, whispering to herself in a voice so different it made the hairs on her neck stand on end. Miss Murgatroyd clutched Miss Hinchcliffe's hand, eyes wide with dawning understanding. The twist changed everything. The masked man who had arrived at the appointed hour had not come to commit violence. He had come to reveal Charlotte's secret, perhaps to blackmail her or simply expose her deception. But someone else, aware of this dangerous knowledge, had used the darkness to ensure his silence forever. The truth began to crystallize in the lamplight. Charlotte, posing as Letitia, had engineered every detail of the evening, or so it now appeared. The precise timing of the blackout, the planned seating of guests, the locked room of the conservatory, even the announcement in the newspaper, all orchestrated to draw out anyone who might know her secret. Inspector Cray's final words in that moment sliced through the stunned quiet. This was never about simple greed. This was about identity, about living someone else's life so completely that the truth itself had to be silenced. The room felt smaller as every guest turned inward, each re-examining every interaction with Letitia over the years. The careful facade they had all accepted now revealed itself as a brilliant, terrifying act, one that might yet cost more than a single life. The conservatory's lanterns sputtered in the cooling night air, their wavering glow flickering across faces that had grown pale and hard. Inspector Cray's revelation still hung heavy, as each guest looked to Letitia or Charlotte, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman who now stood before them, mask slipping with every unsteady breath. Julia was the first to find her voice, brittle but sharp. "If you've lied about who you are," she said, eyes locked on Letitia, "what else have you lied about? Why was the masked man here? Was he coming for you, or with you?" Her words cut through the hush like a blade, and the gathered guests leaned forward, hungry for answers they feared to hear. Letitia's, Charlotte's, composure fractured visibly. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, her eyes searching the room for an ally who might still believe her. Bunny's gaze met hers, wide with hurt and confusion, but the old friend's lips trembled with words she could not form. Miss Hinchcliffe stepped closer to Miss Murgatroyd, as if drawing a line of quiet defense against the woman who had deceived them all. Cray's questions grew sharper, his voice low but relentless. He pressed Charlotte on the telegram delivered days before the gathering, a message that, he revealed, had been sent from London by a solicitor who had once handled Letitia Blackthorne's affairs. The cryptic note hinted that someone was coming to Elmridge to confront the mistress of White Willows about discrepancies in the manor's inheritance records. That someone, Cray said, gesturing to the lifeless masked figure, never lived to speak what he knew. Mitzi, hands twisting in her apron, whispered that she remembered seeing Charlotte speaking to a man near the side garden the evening before the gathering. He wore a hat pulled low, she said, voice cracking. They argued in hushed tones. She told him he was mistaken, that he had the wrong sister. Her account sent a fresh wave of horror through the conservatory. Inspector Cray seized on Mitzi's detail. "You all see now," he said to the stunned assembly, "why every element of tonight was designed to control who was present, who could see whom, and how events unfolded." His eyes swept the group, settling on each guest. Charlotte planned to draw out any threat to her secret, but someone else planned to ensure that secret would never escape these walls. A sudden sob from Bunny startled the room. She stepped forward, hand outstretched as if to touch Charlotte, but let it fall short. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she choked out words heavy with betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me the truth? We share everything, everything." Charlotte's face crumpled for an instant before hardening into an expression that looked carved from stone. In the corners of the room, murmurs rose. Miss Hinchcliffe's eyes gleamed with grim satisfaction. She had long believed White Willows hid dark corners no one dared explore. Patrick's gaze dropped to the floor, his jaw tight with thoughts he dared not voice. Julia's eyes, sharp and measuring, moved between Cray and Charlotte, her mind spinning with the implications for the legacy she had long expected to share. Miss Margaret Temple alone stood silent, eyes fixed on the grand lamp whose broken cord had triggered the blackout. She was remembering something, the second pair of footsteps she had heard, the faint click of a door, the whispered phrase that had reached her ear before the lanterns died. A pattern emerged in her mind, a pattern that suggested Charlotte had not acted alone. As the clock struck 7:30, the guests realized that the darkness they had endured was only the beginning. In the fragile silence that followed Cray's accusations, the web of alliances and enmities binding the guests together began to fray, each thread quivering under the weight of secrets too long kept. The conservatory's hush grew deeper, as if every breath drawn by the guests might disturb the fragile balance, keeping the night from descending fully into chaos. Inspector Cray stepped forward, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He laid the broken pocket watch on the table, its hands frozen at 7, the symbol of the night's first shattering moment. "Consider the precision of that hour," he said quietly, voice steady as the lantern flames. This was no random act. Someone planned the blackout down to the second, not to protect themselves from Charlotte's secret, but to end the threat posed by the masked man's knowledge. He gestured to the diary uncovered earlier, its pages littered with confessions written in Charlotte's careful hand. Yet, as Miss Margaret Temple stepped closer, she drew the room's attention with a single, calm observation. "There is something in this diary that should trouble us all," she said. "The entries end 2 weeks ago, but a note added afterward in a different hand mentions the arrival of an unexpected visitor and promises to deal with him." A collective gasp spread among the guests. Cray demanded to know who among them could match the unfamiliar handwriting. His eyes landed on Patrick, who shifted uncomfortably, and then on Julia, whose face was pale but composed. Miss Margaret Temple continued, her voice soft yet commanding. "Consider also the lamp's severed cord." Whoever cut it knew not only the conservatory's layout, but precisely how long the lamp's weakened filament would last. They counted on darkness falling at the appointed hour, and only someone intimately familiar with this room could do that. Cray nodded, voice rising with urgency. This wasn't the desperate act of Charlotte alone. Someone helped her, or someone used her plan for their own ends. Mitzi's trembling voice piped up, breaking the growing storm of accusations. She described seeing Julia slip away before the guests gathered, her hands clutching a small black case. Julia's head snapped up, eyes flashing. "I was fetching a shawl for Bunny," she insisted, but her voice cracked as Patrick's eyes darted to her, fear and betrayal swirling beneath his careful mask. Miss Hinchcliffe, never one to keep a quiet thought, added her own sharp insight. If the masked man was lured here, and Charlotte expected to control the outcome, then who stood to gain the most if he never spoke a word? As the clock in the hallway chimed 7:15, the pieces fell into place like the final stones in a long hidden path. Cray's voice cut through the stunned quiet. Someone else knew Charlotte's true identity and used her fear as the perfect motive, the perfect cover. Patrick's knees buckled, his face ashen. His sister's hand shot out to steady him, but the gesture came too late to hide the panic flaring in both their eyes. Cray's gaze locked on them, his words ringing with cold certainty. "Patrick Simmons, you had the most to lose if the masked man revealed Charlotte's deception, because your own stake in the manor's inheritance depended on her secret staying buried." The conservatory erupted in a chorus of gasps, chairs scraping across the floor as guests recoiled. Bunny sobbed openly, Mitzi collapsed to her knees, and even Miss Hinchcliffe's usually unflappable composure faltered. And yet, as Patrick stammered his denials, Miss Margaret Temple stepped forward once more. "There's one thing more," she said, voice low but resolute. "The footprints by the side door, they match your boots exactly. You were outside during the blackout, not inside. You slipped in through the garden door to carry out your plan." Every head turned to Patrick, his face contorted by the weight of discovery, his breath shallow and rapid. The conservatory walls seemed to close in around him as the truth at last broke free, and with it the final shreds of the web he had woven to protect himself. What do you think about the shocking revelations in this chapter? Who do you suspect is truly pulling the strings at White Willows Manor? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the breathtaking conclusion to this twisted mystery. Your thoughts could unlock the next clue. Stay tuned. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. A heavy silence settled in the conservatory after Inspector Cray's final accusation. The guests stood motionless, lantern light reflecting wide eyes and faces drawn tight with fear or fury. Every breath felt loud in the hush, as if the entire village of Elmridge had shrunk to the confines of White Willow's glass-walled room. And then, from the corner where she had quietly observed every whispered word and unguarded glance, Miss Margaret Temple stepped forward. She moved with a calm certainty that cut through the room's charged stillness. All eyes turned to her as she set the small brass button she'd found beside the lamp on the table, its polished surface catching the low light. "It's time to set aside every lie," she said softly, yet her voice carried with unyielding strength. "This button belongs to Patrick." It was torn from his sleeve as he hurried through the conservatory during the blackout, and it was found near the severed cord of the grand lamp. A murmur ran through the room, sharp as wind sweeping through dry leaves. Patrick's face went slack, his eyes flitting to Julia as if seeking an anchor. Miss Temple's words continued, each syllable striking like the toll of a clock. The darkness was timed perfectly with the stopped pocket watch, and Patrick, knowing the plan to lure the masked man, seized the opportunity to slip into the room unseen, ensuring the only person who could expose Charlotte's secret was silenced forever. Inspector Cray's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as the final pieces clicked into place. "And the footprints outside the conservatory?" he demanded, voice like cold iron. "They were his as well," Miss Temple answered. "They matched the soles of his boots, exactly." He waited in the garden until the lights died, entered through the side door, and in the confusion carried out his plan. A soft gasp broke from Bunny's lips. She staggered, clutching the back of a chair. "But why, Patrick?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Patrick's voice was hoarse, desperate. "I didn't want it to go this far, but I couldn't let him expose the truth. If Charlotte, Letitia, was unmasked, everything I'd counted on would be gone. The inheritance, the standing, the promise of a life I deserved." Miss Margaret Temple's eyes softened, but her words were unflinching. "You feared losing everything if Charlotte was exposed. But by choosing silence over truth, you lost more than you ever would have otherwise." Inspector Cray stepped forward and laid a firm hand on Patrick's shoulder. The guests exhaled in ragged, relieved breaths, yet their faces were marked by sorrow as well as shock. The night had revealed not only motive and deception, but the dark power of desperation festering behind familiar faces. Julia's face crumpled as she stared at her brother, realizing the depth of his betrayal. Bunny wept openly, her tears a quiet counterpoint to the soft patter of rain beginning to fall beyond the conservatory's glass. Mitzi sank into a chair, eyes wide but strangely clear, as though the night's chaos had lifted a long-held dread from her heart. And there, beneath the flickering lanterns and before the eyes of friends who could never see one another the same way again, the truth of the night at White Willows stood naked and undeniable. The conservatory's lanterns flickered in the rain-streaked night, shadows playing across faces drawn tight with exhaustion and disbelief. The hush held firm as Miss Margaret Temple, standing with quiet authority, began to lay out the tapestry of events that had led them here. She spoke first of the telegram sent to White Willows days before the gathering, a warning from a London solicitor that someone was coming to confirm Letitia Blackthorne's identity. The masked man had been the solicitor's investigator, sent to see whether Charlotte truly was Letitia. His arrival and Charlotte's growing desperation set the entire scheme into motion. Charlotte had planned the gathering to identify and silence anyone who might expose her secret. But Patrick, realizing the masked man's presence threatened not only Charlotte's deception but his own claim to the inheritance, saw an opportunity to solve his problem permanently. Miss Temple described Patrick's movements in painstaking detail, his slipping out through the side garden minutes before the guests assembled, the careful scuffing of his boots to leave footprints that could mislead others, his cutting of the lamp cord so darkness would fall precisely at the final hour. "Then," she said, voice soft but unwavering, Patrick hid in the conservatory's shadows as the guests took their seats. When the lights failed, he stepped forward. The first gunshot was meant to confuse, the second to end the masked man's threat. In the chaos, he slipped back into the room, breathless but unseen. A collective shiver rippled through the room as each guest recalled the blackout, the sudden darkness, the sounds of footsteps, the gasps and cries. The moments they had dismissed as panic now revealed themselves as the critical window during which Patrick carried out his plan. Inspector Cray's eyes glittered as he absorbed every word. He pressed Miss Temple to continue. She recounted Mitzi's conflicting stories, proof not of her guilt, but of her terror. Mitzi had stumbled upon Patrick emerging from the garden, but his whispered threats convinced her to stay silent, fearing blame for what she did not understand. Julia's part, too, was laid bare. She had helped arrange the seating at Charlotte's request, never realizing the plan's true aim. Her loyalty had blinded her to Patrick's darker intentions, even as she noticed his restlessness and the mud clinging to his boots. Miss Temple's gaze swept the room as she described the second crucial clue, the grand lamp's severed cord. Only someone familiar with the conservatory could have timed the blackout so precisely, and Patrick's hours spent pacing the manor in recent days were not the idle wanderings he claimed, but rehearsals for the perfect moment. She ended her reconstruction with a brass button, caught near the lamp's base, torn free as Patrick fumbled in the dark. "That button," she said softly, "is the detail that unraveled your entire plan." Patrick slumped, face ashen. The strength leached from his frame. Julia turned away, tears streaking her cheeks, realization crashing in waves. The others stood frozen, their thoughts whirling through every remembered detail of the night, each piece now slotted into a chilling whole. The rain beat harder against the conservatory's glass, a steady patter like the ticking of a clock marking the final minutes of the longest night Elmridge had ever known. The storm outside the conservatory gathered strength, rain drumming steadily against the glass roof as if to underscore the pounding of hearts within. Patrick's ragged breathing echoed through the silent room. Inspector Cray stood over him, eyes unwavering, while Miss Margaret Temple's quiet composure radiated the certainty of someone who had, at last, seen the entire truth. Patrick's gaze flicked wildly from face to face. Julia's tear-streaked mask of horror, Bunny's trembling sorrow, Charlotte's rigid, hollow stare. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his own words as he began, voice hoarse and low. "I thought I could fix everything. I thought if I protected Charlotte's secret, the legacy would remain ours, but he was going to ruin it all." His words spilled out, each syllable thick with the desperate conviction of a man who had convinced himself of his own necessity. "I followed the masked man through the garden. I knew he'd come straight to the conservatory. I planned every second. When the lights went out, I fired the first shot to throw everyone into confusion. Then the second was meant to silence him forever." A shocked silence hung over the guests, the final pieces of the night's dark puzzle clicking into place. Inspector Cray's expression hardened with grim resolve as he stepped forward. "And Charlotte," he asked quietly, "did she know?" Patrick's eyes flickered to the woman he had sworn to protect. A quiet, painful pause settled over the room. "No," he whispered, broken. "She was desperate to keep her secret, but she never planned for anyone to be harmed. I took that choice into my own hands." Charlotte's face, already pale, seemed carved from marble as the words settled over her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "You fool!" she whispered, voice trembling. "I thought I could keep control, but you destroyed everything." Miss Margaret Temple's soft voice cut through the tense air. "The truth always emerges, no matter how carefully it's hidden, and every lie adds another thread to the net that finally closes around the guilty." The wind rattled the conservatory's doors as Inspector Cray signaled his men waiting beyond the manor gates. Boots thudded down the corridor. Patrick bowed his head, resigned, as strong hands closed around his arms. His eyes met Julia's one last time, a silent plea for forgiveness left unspoken. As he was led from the room, the guests released the breaths they'd held for what felt like hours. The lanterns burned low, their soft glow revealing exhausted, stunned faces. Bunny reached for Charlotte's hand, but found only cold withdrawal. Mitzi sobbed quietly, as if every fear she had ever carried now poured from her in tears. Inspector Cray turned to Miss Temple, voice softer than it had been all night. "You saw what the rest of us missed," he said. "Without your careful eye, this night might have ended in far deeper shadows. The village of Elmridge-on-Glen would never be the same. Friendships cracked, illusions shattered. But the truth had been dragged into the light, and as dawn began to creep over the horizon, pale and quiet, the guests stepped from the conservatory into the morning rain, each forever changed by what they had witnessed within those glass walls. The first rays of morning broke over Elmridge-on-Glen, casting the village in a fragile light. Rain still fell in a soft, steady hush, washing the night's fear and fury into quiet memory. White Willows Manor stood silent, its conservatory's glass panes misted with the breath of a sleepless night. Within the village, whispers spread of the night when masks were ripped away, of inheritance that had fueled desperation, and of the quiet brilliance of Miss Margaret Temple, whose gentle insight had revealed a web of lies with the clarity of morning sun. Though Elmridge would mend, the cracks in its trust would never fully fade. Every footstep along the cobbled lanes would carry the echo of secrets once hidden behind polite smiles. Yet, as dawn grew brighter, a new understanding settled over the village. That truth, however painful, brings the chance for peace. And in that soft light, the villagers began to believe they might someday find it. What did you think of this unforgettable mystery? Did the final twist surprise you, or did you see the clues all along? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear your insights. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling mysteries and classic tales of deception, secrets, and justice. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life.